Welcome and good evening to our Dean's Lecture tonight, the David Clarke Memorial Lecture. It's a thrill for lots of people in this audience, but me in particular, that we've been able to get the David Clarke Memorial Lecture into the cycle of Dean's Lectures, which will make sure that there's a place for this lecture every year from now on. So it's a great thing that we've been able to do tonight. And can I also welcome our speaker, Professor Jodie Hunter. We're really pleased to have you along with us, Jodie. And your topic tonight is going to be gap-gazing or recognising strengths, rethinking mathematics education. And I will introduce Jodie a little bit further on. For those of you I haven't met, I seem to recognise a lot of people here. I'm the Dean, Jim Waterston, and really pleased to welcome you to our faculty tonight. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet tonight, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and recognise any Indigenous people who may be with us tonight. So, as I said before, this is a really special event, and so David's colleagues are going to do the honour sort of at the end by thanking our speaker. So Jan, I'd like to acknowledge you. Jan van Driel will manage the Q&A, and Esther Chan and Carmel Mesiti. I saw you come in just at the end. There you are, Carmel. And so they will do the vote of thanks, and we really appreciate it. And David would be thrilled to know that the three of you are doing that work. So as I said, it's a really special event as we hear from our esteemed guest speaker and focus on David Clarke's career and his achievements over a long period of time. I didn't meet David until 2018 when I became the Dean, 6.5 years ago, and we quickly hit it off. And for those of you that know David and have worked around this place, you'll know that the cafe downstairs in this building was his office, and you would always get a free cup of tea or coffee or whatever you wanted. But he was always there, and that was him, bringing people together, and that was his means of doing that, particularly in that place. But everywhere he went, he did the same thing. I first kind of got to really know him well, and when we went to Toronto to the AERA conference, the American Education Research Association conference, and David was particularly keen that I join him for dinner 5 nights out of the 5, and in the very best restaurants that he could find in Toronto. And being a new dean, I was pretty stressed about who was paying for all this all the time, and so I probably could now, if I'd gone back, I would have enjoyed this much more, knowing that he was paying, or his account from wherever that was paying. And so, but again, it was just bringing people together, colleagues from around the world, and it was just one of the great times, and really helped me sort of move further in my job, knowing that we had great people that can bring great people to our university. So David was an extraordinarily generous educator and a friend who took great joy in the success of those around him. And I think as I got to know him better, I realised, and when he was challenged towards the end, he was still caring about those people around him and how well they were going to succeed, and what he could do to help them. And going, as Sharon will tell you, I'm sure many of you know the story, but David was on his bed in the sort of the lounge room area, and every time I went, there was just a group of people, and just making sure that they were well cared for and acknowledged, and it was a sad time, but a really meaningful time about who David Clarke was right up until the end, and it was fantastic. For much of David's research career, spanning almost 40 years, his research activities centred on capturing the complexity of classroom practice through a program of international video-based classroom research in 20 countries. David joined the University of Melbourne in 1994 at the Faculty of Education, was promoted to full professor in 2004. He dedicated his expertise and passion to the institution until his passing in 2020. He focused on moving the educational research field towards greater critical self-reflection and increasingly sophisticated research designs, as well as research tools for understanding complex teaching and learning practices in different parts of the world. If I can just add, in different parts of the world, I just had the opportunity to go back to the AERA in Philadelphia 3 weeks ago, and the Universitas group of deans, Universitas 21. It was created about 25 years ago and created by David Clarke. never was a dean, but he pulled these deans together and managed that group and kept them together throughout the rest of his life. And so it was brilliant for us to go back in Philadelphia and talk about David's work and what he did to propel the organisation. And it was normally a very short half-a-day conference. So we've rebuilt the organisation in David's honour. It's now a much bigger organisation. We're publishing together. We've got contacts throughout the year. We're working in university practices to bring about opportunities for people to share roles right across that university. That's 21. And so I know that David would be really proud to see that what he started and his legacy is going on now to be bigger and better, and certainly making sure that all universities represented in that group are thriving. And so it's been fantastic. So during his time at the university, David founded the International Centre for Classroom Research, ICCR, in 2002, a major international research facility specialising in the collection, storage and analysis of data, principally video data related to the study of learning and teaching in classrooms, mostly mathematical classrooms. The ICCR comprises of an international network of classroom researchers, and David's legacy is in this active and vibrant international research community that he established and sustained. It's a bit of a sort of repetition here about the way that he establishes things, brings people in, makes everyone successful and moves forward. David left a lasting impact throughout his large body of research, his wide and multidisciplinary international networks, his innovative digital research programs, and his expertise in video-based education research. In addition to attracting funding from national and international agencies, David published 12 books, over 50 book chapters, more than 70 refereed journal articles, 90 refereed conference proceedings, and he supervised more than 20 doctoral students to successful completion throughout his career. Not long after David passed, we sought permission from the University Council to rename room 417 in this building the David Clarke Research Classroom. David's role in developing and promoting this innovative research classroom with adjacent video control room made this the most appropriate way to honour his memory, and it's with deep respect that we also honour David's legacy throughout this lecture tonight. And can I welcome Sharon LaFontaine, who I just threw to without sort of mentioning, but welcome along. We really appreciate you being here. Thanks, Sharon. I would now like to take the opportunity to introduce our speaker, our guest speaker, Professor Jodie Hunter, who's with us today, all the way from New Zealand. So thank you for making the trip, Jodie. Then you'll hear a little bit about her notable career. Professor Hunter is an educator and a researcher in mathematics education and Pacific education of proud Cook Island heritage. Previously, she was a research fellow and lecturer at the University of Plymouth in the United Kingdom and a primary school teacher in New Zealand. Professor Hunter is currently a Rutherford Discovery Fellow and has been a Leverhulme visiting professor and Fulbright scholar. She has won a number of prestigious research awards, including the British Society in Research in Learning Mathematics Janet Duffin Award, the New Zealand Association of Research in Education Research Group Award, and the Mathematics Education Research Group of Australasia Practical Implementations Awards. Jodie has taken several leadership positions in education, including being appointed as the Chair of the Board for the Pacific Education Foundation, Deputy Chair of the Board for New Zealand Council of Education Research, and as a member of the writing group for the Mathematics and Statistics Curriculum Refresh Team. Professor Hunter's research interests and expertise include mathematics education for equity and social justice, early algebra, teacher education, Pacific education, and culturally sustaining pedagogy. Her work includes leading professional development and learning across New Zealand, and Cook Islands and the United Kingdom. With David Clarke's work building understanding of the types of engagement involved when students learn mathematics, and Professor Hunter's exploration of new perspectives on mathematics education and the importance of embracing diversity in learning, it is most fitting that Jodie presents this special memorial lecture. So please join me in offering a warm welcome to Professor Jodie Hunter to present the David Clarke Memorial Lecture, and I'll say it again, Gap Gazing or Recognising Strength, Rethinking Mathematics Education. Welcome, Jodie.
Kia orana, malaua lele, bulavanaka, talofa lava, whakalofa lahi atu, and warm Pacific greetings. So I just wanted to share with you some of our beautiful Pacific language from across the Pacific Ocean before I start. I also wanted to begin by saying thank you for this invitation. It's a real privilege to be asked to present this lecture. I was really lucky to have met David at MURGA as an early career researcher, and always would attend his sessions and listen to the groundbreaking work that he was doing, and found it very fascinating and interesting. And in return, I know that David was always really caring about coming to young early career researchers' presentations and listening to the work that other people were doing, and was always very interested in that as well. In particular, I knew that David was interested in mathematics teaching across different cultural contexts and, of course, learners' perspectives. And I was inspired as an early career researcher after listening to David's talks to look myself at video elicitation, because he used that a lot in the work. I'd never heard of it. And that became a real interest for myself in thinking about learners' perspectives. So in my PhD, I used photo elicitation, and the work that I'll be sharing with you today also builds on that in terms of using visual methods to find out about the worlds of children that we work with, as well as teachers. And I think the really important thing about using these visual methods that David pioneered was that this is a way for us as educators and researchers to gather the voices of those who we often do not hear from. And that's what I'll be sharing today. And that's also why it's such a privilege, because it's amazing to be able to share work from Pacific people across these very small islands, and also from New Zealand, who really do have very limited voice, I think, a lot in our education system. And that's what I'm acknowledging in this title here, is that often what we see presented in the media and what we can see presented in even international studies like TIMSS and PISA is this kind of gap-gazing approach, and that these children and these communities are failing in mathematics. But instead, I'd like to think about recognising the strengths that we have within our own communities and using this to rethink what mathematics education can be and should be. So I just wanted to begin by sharing some of the background to the research that I'll be presenting to you today. So we've had ongoing, both in Australia and New Zealand, around the world, this underrepresentation of diverse groups of people. And this includes Indigenous and migrant communities in mathematics. So as a Pacific person with Cook Island heritage, Indigenous to the Cook Islands, but a migrant in New Zealand, from a migrant community in New Zealand. So that's a kind of a little bit of a different intersection. But I know also for First Nations people in Australia, Aboriginal communities and Torres Strait Islanders, that there's similar stories that happen of this kind of failure of our schooling systems to support learning of groups of children. An example that I can take from New Zealand is that in the most recent national monitoring study that we had, only 11% of our Pacific students in New Zealand schools were working at the appropriate curriculum level at Year 8. So I think those are pretty sobering results to think about how we're serving these children. Similarly, I know after many years of NAPLAN in Australia that there's been no significant shifts in terms of achievement for children who come from First Nation backgrounds. We can also see this underrepresentation in New Zealand in low enrolments in tertiary and extremely low enrolments in postgraduate beyond honours. So we have very, very low uptake of science subjects, including mathematics. And in our science faculty and universities, we have only around 4% of the staff who come from a Pacific heritage, despite the fact that our Pacific population is between 8 to 10%. It's less than 1% of our professors in New Zealand universities are of Pacific heritage. So all of this is kind of painting a picture that we can see in terms of underrepresentation, both in schooling in terms of achievement results and tertiary education and in employment. So what often happens with this underrepresentation is that we have this accompanying narrative of a gap story that explains the underrepresentation. And this gap story really includes blaming the children, blaming the communities, blaming the culture for the lack of representation in our mathematics classrooms. And we can hear this when we hear deficit theorising by educators who talk about children coming to school with no mathematics, children not being able to count to 5 or count to 10, but always framing that in English and as if counting is mathematics itself. But I think from the research I've been doing, I also hear the deficit theorising from the children and from communities themselves. And so this is part of this kind of speaking back, is thinking about how we can position our young people to see their culture in a positive light and to think about what they're bringing. I can share with you some of the quotes that I've had from children when we've asked them how they feel being Pacific, whatever ethnicity they identify with in the classroom. So I have a quote from a Tokelauan boy who we asked, how do you feel being Tokelauan in the mathematics classroom? His response was, it feels weird to be Tokelauan in the maths classroom because Tokelauans don't do maths. Similarly, we had a young Samoan girl who was maybe 12 years old. And when we asked her, how do you feel being Samoan in the mathematics classroom? She said, I'm Samoan, but you have to be Palangi to do maths. So when I'm doing maths, I become a Palangi. But when it gets hard and I can't do it anymore, I go back to being Samoan. And similarly, I thought maybe this is because these children are in New Zealand schools and New Zealand contexts, so perhaps this is happening because of that. We asked the very same question in one of the settings of the research that I'll be sharing with you today, which is a tiny island nation called Niue. And the response I had from one of the children when we asked her, she said, different cultured people, they're smarter at maths. Us Niueans, we don't understand. So despite these kind of stories that I'm sharing with you of both learners' perspectives of their own culture in a negative light and teachers' perspectives, we do have a growing body of research which really relates this underrepresentation and the perspectives of these children as a failure of us, our education systems, to serve both Indigenous and migrant communities in our mathematics classrooms. And one of the things that I think really feeds into this is that we've privileged specific ways of knowing and being in the classroom, which then create deficit discourses. So for example, if we think that at 5 years old, the most important thing is for a child to be able to count up to 100 in English, then that means that we're putting a whole lot of children at the other end of saying that they're coming to school unprepared. Other kinds of aspects of this are if we think that our classrooms need to be competitive and children working individually and working at speed without help from anybody else, then we ignore the cultural values of different groups of children who may come from collectivist cultures. So as a researcher, I became increasingly interested, and coming from Cook Island heritage myself, which I'll talk about a little bit as I go on, I became increasingly interested in work that looked at the different types of knowledge systems that children could enter school with. And so the work that I'll be sharing with you today builds on two theoretical frameworks. One of them is funds of knowledge. And this work was undertaken by Louis Moll, who just recently passed away. He worked at University of Arizona and was very interested in looking at Latino families and the kinds of activities that children did at home in their family and community. And his theory was that all people and all cultures have bodies of knowledge and skills which are historically accumulated, culturally developed, and which support individual and household functioning and also well-being. So his argument about why particular groups of children don't do well in school was that, in fact, teachers don't recognise the funds of knowledge that children are bringing into the school. And I think that's very much the case in our New Zealand classrooms, and I dare say I think it's probably similar in a lot of Australian classrooms as well. So I think even myself as a teacher, I didn't necessarily think about all of the strengths and experiences that children were bringing into the classroom. The other work that I've become more interested in recently is the idea of Indigenous and local knowledge systems. So it's very similar, the work dovetails together. And I've just got a couple of references of people who have written about this, but the idea of Indigenous and local knowledge systems is that these are systems that support interdisciplinary factors, including language and values, and they underpin practices which relate to things such as food production, conservation, sustainability, health and education. And I hope you'll be able to see in the data that I share today how these types of knowledge systems influence the way that we live, but also are connected to different bodies of knowledge such as mathematics. So the question that will be framing the talk and the data that I show to you and share with you today is how can we as educators provide ways to document and value the funds of knowledge and knowledge systems of our students from different cultural backgrounds. And the conclusion and discussion of this will also be oriented around how does this help us rethink mathematics education and what can we do as educators differently. So I wanted to start by sharing the location of both who I am and where my work is situated. So we can call this area Te Moana Nui a Kiwa, and this is the Great Pacific Ocean region. As part of sharing this, I'd like to share with you who I am as a Cook Island New Zealander. So I've just circled there the group of Cook Islands, which are named Cook Islands because of Captain Cook discovering them, but originally were in fact a number of islands which actually had different language systems and different stories and a lot of competition between them. So my grandmother was born on Manahiki, which is a tiny, tiny island closer to Papeete in Tahiti rather than Rarotonga, which is the main island of the Cook Islands. And so this is the island that she was born on. It's basically the mouth of a volcano, underwater volcano, you can see around the edges. So you can imagine being born in this island 98 years ago. She lived a very different life than I grew up having. She came to New Zealand and was brought to New Zealand, in fact, in World War II to work as a domestic servant in a prominent scientist's house. And that's the story of my kind of heritage and growing up. My grandmother lived with us from when I was 7 years old. She sadly died last year, but she was a very influential figure both in my household and in my family as well. I want to share with you also Niue. So Niue is the research context, which is one of the research contexts which I'll be sharing with you today. This is a very tiny island again. So it has a population probably of around between 9 to 1,200 people. It's a little bit difficult to know. According to the census, it says 1,400, but I suspect that a lot of people put extra family members on the census forms. But it's called the Rock of the Pacific, and it's basically a rock. So it's a rock and exposed coral. It's an amazing place if you ever have an opportunity to visit there. Tiny island and has a lot of caves, no beaches, but it has rock pools that you can swim in, and the whales migrate past there in July and August. So it's a very remote island. You can only travel there from New Zealand, and there's a flight sometimes once a week, sometimes twice a week, depending on what season it is. I was very lucky that in around 2017 or 18, we were asked to go and work up with the teachers on Niue to help them with mathematics teaching and learning. And I since then was able to do some research up there where I did a pilot for a larger project looking at using photography as ways of students documenting the community and home experiences that they saw as connected to mathematics. So in this project, we worked with the families and the children. We gave cameras out and explained that what we wanted them to do was to take photographs of where they saw mathematics in their lives, not at school, but instead in their kind of everyday living and things that they were doing outside of school. And we came back to the island about 3 months later, and then we used an Indigenous methodology called talanoa, which is a type of storytelling interviews with the photographs. So the children chose which photographs they wanted to share with us, and then they told us the stories that were behind the photographs. We made an early decision, well, not early enough, but to begin with, we asked the children to say, what's the maths that's in the photograph? And then we soon learnt that that was a really unhelpful question to ask, because basically the story got reduced to this kind of school maths context. I will talk about that when I show you one of them. So instead we just said, tell us about this. What's happening in that photograph? And, what's the story you'd like to share with us? And I think this storytelling interview, and this is where I see a link again to David's work with video stimulated recall. But the storytelling interviews are another kind of innovative approach that we can use to take a holistic approach to thinking about mathematics and mathematics in a wider sense, rather than that kind of school orientation to maths. Oh, sorry, that's a picture of Niue, just to give you a little bit of context to where this data is coming from. Yeah, so you can see it's the blue water there is like a rock pool that you can go and snorkel in. All the fish get trapped in it, so it's like swimming in a giant aquarium. But it's all very tidal, so you can't go there when it's high tide, otherwise it's, a bit dangerous. And the final, I've just finally circled South Auckland, well, Auckland, where I come from, which is, the place in New Zealand. The most important place. No, South Auckland has the biggest Pacific population in the world. So, we have whole areas in South Auckland which are, Pacific families living in. I've been asked before sometimes when I've been doing ethics applications or whatnot to say, if you say you're orienting this teaching towards Pacific children, what about the other children? I'm like, well, everybody there is from a Pacific background. So what I'm going to share with you now is the photographs that the families and the children shared with us. So the second part where I've circled South Auckland, we ran a parallel project in South Auckland where we used a similar methodology. I will do the disclaimer that we unfortunately began the project in 2020. So some of the results that I'll share may be framed by the fact that it was throughout COVID and it wasn't typical life necessarily. But what I was going to share with you first was to start from the photographs and the stories from the children who lived in South Auckland. And then I'll move to thinking about what are the kind of commonalities between the data that we collected from New Zealand and the data from Niue. And then I'm going to finish by showing you the data that was from Niue, which were themes and stories that we didn't see in New Zealand. Yeah, quite different, I think, indicating the very different lifestyle there. So I just start with sharing these play activities, and that came through very interestingly. This came through in New Zealand. We had no photographs of children playing in Niue at all. Okay, and there's actually a good reason for that. It's traditionally, in a cultural sense, Pacific people saw kind of an apprenticeship model, and you'll see it when I show you the data from Niue, where the children are really actively involved in keeping the household functioning and working together collectively to do so. So there was photographs from the children in Niue of swimming and doing sports, but there was no photographs of them playing at home with their siblings. In contrast, in South Auckland, a lot of the children brought photos in of play and play activities. And so I'll just give you a little bit of explanation of some of these and the backstory behind them. So the first one was actually one of the first photographs that was shared, and I have to admit to looking at the photograph and thinking, we shared this with the teachers as well and used them to plan tasks, and this photograph over there, I looked at it and I thought, oh no, this project is not working at all. And I thought, I'm going to show this to the teachers and they're just going to be like, what is she going on about? And then I read the little explanation from the child, which was her story behind why she'd taken the photograph. And she was a little 5-year-old girl, and she started off and she said, I took this photo because it's big. And I was like, okay. Then she said, well, it's like paper, and I like to play birthday parties. So what I do is I get my toys, and I wrap my toys in it, and I see if it can fit. And I thought, what a beautiful example of a child talking about mathematical concepts in play, really spontaneously. So at that point, I was like, oh, this is okay. It's going to be okay. Okay, we had other photos of, for example, children making dough or slime, and they were talking about how they wanted to make cookies out of it, so they rolled balls up and then they flattened it down because that was how you could make a circle. So these kind of rich ideas about imaginary play that connect to mathematics. We also had games, of course. So I have a picture of drafts where one of the children was talking about how you use patterns when you're playing this, and that you move diagonally and you can jump over people, but you use the patterns so that you can jump over them twice. And if I'm red and one was there, a black one, there was a lot of gesture in it. So, I mean, it's nearly a shame that we didn't video this because you miss out on that richness. But he was talking about if I'm red and one's there, I can jump over that. And if there's another one, I can jump over that. And you can even triple jump if you get the pattern right. So he was talking about the kind of strategizing he was using in playing these types of games. Of course, we have pictures of Monopoly and the children talking about the opportunities to calculate and to add up the dice numbers and things like that, which is, probably falling more into the traditional, And that was evident that for a lot of children, the photographs they first shared with us were about calculations and number situations. So we also had this child, I had to put this photograph in, he brought in probably 100 and something photographs of him playing Fortnite. So, but he did go into great detail about the kind of visual skills that he was using to navigate and playing the game, and then the V-Bucks and the proportion of what you pay to how many tokens you get and what you should use them for. So, and just down here was another one with Lego, which I think is really familiar for all of us too. And the children talked about the kind of measurement concepts when you're building, even height and things like that, and building structures through this. So all of these were, I suppose, anticipated that, we had anticipated that children would see mathematics through play. Well, what I didn't anticipate so much was that there would be such a stark difference between the children in Niue, who had no photographs of play, and the children in South Auckland, also of Pacific descent, both culturally from similar cultural backgrounds, who it just wasn't evident in the photographs. So these photos are also from New Zealand as well, and from our Pacific community in New Zealand. So I really liked this photograph, and this is one of the reasons I've chosen to share it. And I've called these photographs Service in the Home and in the Community. So this was also the time in 2020 when there was a lot of news articles about how children, in particular children from low socioeconomic backgrounds, which is unfortunately our Pacific communities live in low socioeconomic neighbourhoods and communities. There was a lot of alarm in the media that there were children missing out, not going to school, doing nothing, just sitting at home. I'm not sure what people thought they were doing, but doing absolutely nothing and losing all this learning. And we were lucky for the families agreed to continue the project with us. So we did interviews via Zoom during that time. And this was one of the photographs that was shared with us, where this child was talking about her experience of staying at her grandma's house during lockdown with one of her parents, and that she was helping her grandmother tile actually they tiled the laundry and they tiled the bathroom and the kitchen as well. So she was talking about this process of tiling, and we could see this rich opportunities for her to learn about measurement concepts in it. And so I'm not making the claim that she was doing mathematics when she was doing this, but then with the teachers, we could build on this when we came to measurement and area. We could build on her experience in doing that in terms of introducing children to area through tiling in a way that they could connect to and see. And similarly, this is a type of community service, so this was obviously during a non-lockdown time. And these children were talking about the work that they were doing at a place called Totra Park, which is a nature reserve, and they were working with traps, and doing park ranging. So in this, they were learning about native birds and trees and putting out the traps and thinking about the distance and the coverage of where you need to put traps to ensure that you're covering the park appropriately to catch rats and possums probably as well. And also thinking about the types of footprints that you have in the traps with the black card, so then you can tell what type of pest it is. And we can see here again these concepts of length and area, and we also see a strong intersection in the second photograph here in terms of the relationship with the environment and offering service in the community and thinking about how we can be a citizen and a member of our community. I just move here into the kind of shared context that we could see in terms of both New Zealand and in Niue. So food preparation was really a context across both different areas where you could see some kind of shared knowledge systems that were happening in both sites. So both of these were about cooking and, in fact, have connections to measurement concepts, but also quite strong connections to ratios as well. So this was from Niue, and it's a type of coconut porridge that is made in Niue called nane, and it's, you use pia, which is like a starch. So you mix it together, and this was a 13-year-old boy who was talking about making the pia using the pia to get the consistency. And if you don't put enough in, it's too liquid, but if you put in too much, it becomes too thick. And you have to get the right amount of pea, coconut water, and coconut flesh. And he talked about it having to be a balance, well, not really a balance, but more pea than coconut flesh, and then a balance of coconut water to the pea as well. And this here was another child from New Zealand who was talking about, a Pacific child from New Zealand who was talking about making smoothies. And she was talking about how she needed to measure the ingredients because if it could taste too much like yogurt, or it would be too watery if you put too much water in it. Yeah. So again, we can see these examples of children engaging with concepts of measurement, of ratios, and proportions as well in their everyday life, which we can use as teachers as a platform to think about introducing concepts. The Niue, I will just say, because some of the other data that I'll present, Niue actually, Nu means coconut, so Niue, the whole island, is named after coconuts, basically. And coconuts have a really significant role in the country. So they're a food source, but I'll show you some other photographs and talk through what other role they play, because they actually do have a really important part of life in the Pacific that I think we don't really know very much about. I learned a lot, actually, from this project about that. Okay, and the last shared context that was really apparent in the children's photographs that they shared in the stories was this traditional craft work. So they gave beautiful descriptions of craft work, including both what the children had at home. So, for example, that was an axe from Samoa, which one of the boys in the project in New Zealand shared with us. But we also had descriptions from the children of making these types of cultural activities or cultural craft work. So this was weaving baskets, and you can see this young girl over here doing harakeke, which is like weaving flax together to make a basket or to make decorations. In that case, she was talking about making decorations for her grandparents' grave. So she was making flax flowers to honour her grandmother. We also had children who talked about making fufu, which is here. This is one of the children from Niue. And that she's dressed in a traditional outfit. So fufu is the traditional headband, and she has kaho male, which is like the leaf necklaces that you can see. And she talked about that process of measurement, of using the right amount, and of weaving it together as well. And the other one here is a ta'ovala, which is Tongan, so that's for a waistband used for dancing as well. So all of these examples that these children shared with us highlighted the strong background of mathematics within Pacific heritage. So this included aspects of geometry, you can see, algebra in terms of the patterns that we're using, both repeating patterns and growing patterns, and also measurement concepts again. So I can look at these and hear the stories of the children and see how these repeating and growing patterns and motifs, which are seen across craft work, tattoos, clothing, are generated from nature and are handed down through families over an extended period of time. So, for example, in the axe that you can see there, you can see the triangles, and triangles in Pacific culture have a really important significance as representing shark teeth. And in our culture, shark teeth are seen as protector. It's, a protector. So, and the different types of shark's teeth that you can see represented, evident there, whale's tails as well there. So this kind of idea that this is handed down through generations and is generational knowledge, that was also explicitly acknowledged by this little girl here who said our ancestors wore these for dancing. So she had pride in seeing this. So I just move here into talking about just the Niuean context, which really was quite different than the children who were living, Pacific children who were living in New Zealand. And this was interesting as well because a lot of the children in Niue live between Niue and New Zealand. So they'll live up on Niue for, a year or a couple of years, and then they'll also live in New Zealand at different times as well. But the experiences that they were having were very different. So like I said before, coconuts, really important. Coconuts are really important because it's a food source. It's also used as, we make sennet rope out of coconut, so when you husk it down, You make a rope, which is a really strong rope that you can use for building and that you can use for waka, which are the canoes. And you're also using the husking, like this child here was talking about, as like a type of mulch for your garden. Yeah. So this was interesting. He was talking about having to hook the coconuts down from the coconut trees and husking them as well, and having to think about how you husk them carefully because you don't want to pop them, you don't want to waste it, and then using the husk for compost, putting it around trees, and how many husks you would get from one coconut and what area that would cover. And then he also talked about this need to think about when you harvest a coconut tree. And when you're looking, because if you don't harvest them at the right time, if it's high winds, the tree breaks, the coconuts fall, it can be quite dangerous. You don't want to park under a coconut tree. But also, he was talking about that need to think about where do you stand when you hook it, and, you know, the kind of, the angle that they come and how quickly it comes for where you stand. So again, we can see this connections across mathematics, including probability and geometry and measurement, in regards to selecting which coconut to take first from which tree. But there's also positions to catch the coconuts based on the angle, and measurement concepts related to height and space and force. The other photographs that children shared and talked about their experiences were really about food production. So in Niue, the children are actively involved in growing and cultivating and harvesting food as well. So the children shared with us photographs of taro or banana plantations, which they worked on with their families, talked about the spacing of the trees. They talked about spearfishing from the reef. And this is where I said this is the right question to ask, is tell us the story. Because with this, when we asked the child first, we said, what's the maths? And he said, oh, how many fish you catch and then how many you throw back again. And I was like, And so then I said, oh, no, actually just tell us the story, what was happening there. And he gave us this beautiful story of how he was standing with his father on the edge of the reef, and his father had the spear gun, and he had to angle it, and he had to step backwards or forwards depending on the size of the fish, and then he had to make the decision about when to shoot the spear gun to get the fish. And also caring for livestock was another kind of key feature. So the last one that I'll share here is about a community cultural event. So in Niue we have hair cutting, we have coming of age ceremonies. We have them in Cook Islands as well. So a child will not have their hair cut until around 8 years old, sometimes older. In Niue this is a really big community event, and it shows the collectivist culture that we build upon. So a child has their hair cut, everybody comes and shares, gives money or gifts, and then in return you're given a packet of food and other kind of things for coming and attending this hair cutting ceremony. Yeah. So this photo here was of taro, which is another really, important food source, and in the bundles, and the child was talking about, you have to see how many taros you have to give out to other people, you put them in bundles, you put them in rows, then you look at the money, and you see who's given the most money, and whoever has given the most money, they get the most feed. So you can see this kind of collectivism coming through here, but also thinking about, mathematical ways of sharing out that food. So what do we learn as educators about this? What can we take back to our classroom? Firstly, I think what you can see threaded through here is this idea of collectivist cultural values. And most of those photos that the children were sharing, it was about service. It was about service to the community. It was about service to your family. It was about looking after everybody. So there was really an intersection between cultural values and ways of being and the photographs and experiences that were shared in relation to mathematics. That's just a Pacific value picture of Pacific values that we have that are recognised in policy documents but also in research in New Zealand. What else can we learn from these stories? Well, I think what we can say is that Pacific people, along with other Indigenous and those of First Nations, we've been positioned often in a deficit framing to mathematics, and we've positioned ourselves in a deficit framing towards mathematics. But I think what we can say from this research platform is that we can speak back against this deficit framing and instead share the stories of mathematics that are frequently overlooked or ignored. I will say also, though, that the experience and knowledge systems of the Pacific students in New Zealand was significantly different than those in Niue. My idea is probably that this is to do with shifts in customary norms for migrant communities. What was important, though, was framing questions in a way that the students could richly describe the activity, and then we could, as educators, use a mathematical lens to look at what was mathematical in that. The photographs provided a context for the children to talk about their lives outside school, and also a tool to help those children recognise mathematics. And in this way, we could position the students and the families as experts on their own lives. Thinking mathematics education, I think we can say that highlighting funds of knowledge in these different types of knowledge systems offers a way to highlight that people's lives have dynamic complexity and that there's lots of different ways to be part of a cultural group, not just one. I think we have the potential to also reflect on how curriculum, resource material and textbook schemes potentially perpetuate stereotypes about who does maths and where mathematics is found. So instead, we need to start thinking about how we can come up with localised and place-based forms of curriculum innovation. And I just wanted to finish with the children's words because I can't say it any better than they did, so I've just got a couple of slides of what the children said at the end of the project. So this was a child in Niue. He said, "First I thought it was going to be a bit hard because everything just seemed normal, but once you think and have a mindset of looking for maths, it's actually more common than you think." This is one of the teachers who we shared the data that we collected with, and she said, "I thought that maths didn't have a culture, so that was a whole new idea for me. We work really hard now at locating problems in the culture of our children, letting them know that we've pulled ideas from their world is really important." And these are just two from the parents who were involved. So one of them said, "When we first started taking photographs, that's when I was kind of like, oh my God, it's maths. Actually, it's like everywhere." And then I really enjoyed this quote from one of the other parents who said, "When you think about maths, it's our culture, it's our tradition, those treasures that they're teaching, that's the maths." And just to finish off, I like to give this message that maths is part of Pacific culture. Our ancestors were mathematicians. We navigated over that vast Pacific Ocean in a very purposeful way to different island nations. So I have here a traditional waka, which was, people were navigating Pacific Oceans far before Europeans started navigation. That's a traditional star compass from Hawaii as well. And that's just a tribute to my family because I always bring my family with me. This is my mother, her sisters and cousins, and the quilts you can see in the background are made by my grandmother. But like the children say, my culture is in everything I do. It is in everything I do, and it's always supposed to be in everything I do. And that's the words of a Tokelauan child from the same school after we'd worked for a number of years with them that the first child was from, who'd said Tokelauans don't do maths. And the other quote that we have here, just to finish off on, is when the problems are about us, you can see that maths is real, it's useful, not just something random you do at school.
Thank you, Jodie. My name is Jan van Driel, and together with Carmel, Mesiti and Esther Chen, I am leading the International Community of Classroom Research Hub, and that way we continue the work that David Clarke started a long time ago. This is, as you've heard, the 4th David Clarke Memorial Lecture, and I'm very grateful that it is now included in the Dean's Lecture Series of the Faculty of Education, so thank you very much, Jim. My role now is just to moderate the Q&A. We have, I don't know exactly how much time we have, but we have some time for questions and to Jodie. But first of all, I want to thank you, Jodie, for this wonderful presentation. You have definitely broadened my view of mathematics to include all sorts of daily activities and how it is embedded in cultural contexts. And also the natural relationships with science, as you demonstrated in the examples of the coconut and the pia. But that's enough for me. If you have a question, I think there's a roaming microphone around with maybe two. Just raise your hand and attract the attention of the microphone and go ahead.
Thank you. I'm a mathematics teacher, Year 7 through to VCE in Victoria. I teach at Luther College in Croydon North, and it's a very Anglo-Saxon background student community and also second-generation Chinese background. I find a lot of frustration in the curriculum, in the way that I'm tied to the curriculum, both the Australian curriculum, also the Victorian curriculum, and the way I teach mathematics. I love your approach to it, the practical approach, the community approach, real-world approach to mathematics. But I find that when I'm teaching it, I get resistance from both parents and also from, I guess the overall ATAR that the students need to achieve once they're in Year 12. I'm just wondering, and it's just my own wonderings, how we tie real world and the beauty of mathematics and what it can do for us practically, patterns of mathematics, the way in which you're describing that boy at the beach with his father and catching the fish, into a world where the curriculum is so bland and isn't encapsulating all that mathematics can be for the students. I find so many students disengaged unnecessarily from mathematics in my classrooms. I hope you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, I do.
Cheers.
I do, yeah. So I've done a lot of work. This is part of a research platform, and this is just one part of it. So we use these photographs with the teachers as well to look at kind of curriculum material. Quite often it was pre-prepared, and then we tried to pull out, like the patterns, for example. We've written problems which use growing patterns which are from the Pacific context instead. So it's exactly the same mathematical structures that you need to be teaching and the same concepts, but instead of using the kind of what we see in New Zealand curriculum material, which is often generic kind of block patterns, we've taken the patterns which come from like a Te Vaivai, which is a Cook Island quilt, or the Ta'awala, and we've recontextualised with the teachers for that. And we do a mix, of kind of using the cultural contexts of the children as well as using more abstract mathematical contexts. I think that's important as well. In a way, with some of the work that we did, some of the teachers in the high school worked with the coconuts and with the angles to develop problems and graphing and things like that as well. Yeah, so it was really about taking, I think what we did was we didn't necessarily think, I think sometimes what we can do when we get this really contrived background is we think, oh, we're going to teach multiplication. Oh, what I'll do is like coconut trees, and I'll do like eight trees, and there's like 9 coconuts on each, and how many coconuts altogether? Yeah. So we tried very hard to avoid doing that, but instead to think about how we could kind of draw what was mathematical out, and then think about problems that we were using at different times and how we could connect to those as well. But in a way, I can say that it's been highly effective in terms of both changing the children's perspective, but also in terms of the children's achievement in mathematics. So the island is involved in I think it's Pilsner, which is Pacific Island Small Nations Assessment. And Niue has gone from having around 65% of the children at the curriculum level at Year 6 to 85% in the most recent one. And that's been a gradual process. Yeah. So I think it's, I guess from my perspective, I kind of think it gives the children access, like you're talking about children, when I'm talking about Pacific children, when they are working with patterns that come from their own cultural background and that are familiar to them, I notice that the children are able to generalise it much, see that structure and generalise it, which is what we want them to be doing, rather than having to grapple with the kind of context or that structure of the pattern first, and then, being kind of held back by that. Yeah, I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Jodie. Just a response to Jodie. So we are friends and we have been colleagues. And my name is Wee Tiong. I'm the Professor of Maths Education here. And you might be interested to know that in our subjects here, we have a subject that actually talks about this in the Australian context. So how different cultures, and including the Western cultures and the Chinese cultures, embedded in the activities of counting, playing, explaining, and so on and so forth, mathematical ideas, in the everyday things that they do, whichever cultures they come from.
Yeah, because I think building on that too, that what was important for us with the teachers was to say that it's not always like your culture kind of culture, it's also like games and popular culture. Yeah, so, it's thinking about the kind of popular culture, the lived lives of the children, rather than always having to take it back to the kind of cultural perspective. Yeah.
What jumps to my mind is song lines in the Indigenous culture. It's so prevalent by the elders, and it's essentially memorising directions because everything was so verbal. So the mathematics is huge in that, and also the weaving. So they're two very important aspects of the Indigenous culture which are intensively mathematical. So that comes naturally, I guess, to the Indigenous people.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the same in Pacific culture with our navigational history and the forms of navigation that were used, which were really similar, but we used in terms of like looking at cloud formations, looking at wave patterns, and using that and star navigation to navigate rather than using the, yeah. And I mean, I think there's also a place for talking about the historical mathematics that our ancestors have used and the pride that we need to take in that, to be thinking about how Pacific people, you know, were mathematicians, and we've got this really strong history of mathematics. So, I mean, it's been a bit of a, I suppose, an awakening for myself as well. Like I talked about my grandmother, and my grandmother only went to school until she was around 11 years old, and then she was sent to Rarotonga to work, and then to New Zealand. And so, you know, growing up, I didn't really think of her and her kind of mathematics, but she made, like I showed you the picture of those beautiful quilts called te vaivai, which have all of these patterns embedded in them. They have all of the whole lot of geometrical concepts and all of those kinds of things which are embedded into them as well. So I think, like my mother would say, she for years would say, oh, I got my maths from my father, who was Irish New Zealander. But then, you know, as she's kind of gotten older, and myself as well, we were like, actually, it's from my grandmother as well. Yeah, so.
Thank you, Jodie. Myself and my colleague here work, excuse me, closely with First Nation students at the tertiary level, and we're particularly interested in developing maths and confidence in maths. But we find that for many students there's a real diversity in their own connection to their culture. And I wonder whether, particularly for the students, maybe not Niue, but for South Auckland, whether the opportunity to engage with culture through maths also strengthened their identity, and how that interplay might have worked in terms of building both strengths at once.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for parents as well. So we interviewed the parents. The parents were part of the project all along the way. We shared the photographs and worked with the parents as well, looking at them. And when we interviewed the parents at the beginning of the project, and we said, you know, how do you use maths in your lives? Most of the parents were like, oh, I don't really know, maybe shopping? That was, yeah. And yeah, so the kind of, that last quote that I shared with the parent who was saying about it being your culture and, what was it? Sorry, he said that when you think about maths, it's our culture, it's our tradition, and those treasures that they're teaching, that's maths. That you know, was such a turnaround, and there was a real kind of theme that came across all the interviews with the parents at the end, as well as the children, about this kind of, oh, now I've got such a wider view of maths, and I used to think it was all about number and counting and that's it, and now I kind of see how we are engaging in mathematics in our everyday lives in a lot more meaningful way, but also that it is part of our culture, it's part of our identity. Yeah, so I mean, that's what the big project, part of my aims were, I mean, you don't say that to the research funder, but part of my aims were, you know, really wanting to have parents and children be able to be proud and recognise what we have in our culture already. Because, I mean, I suppose I did put that into my research application, because I thought it was, you know, that's how do we become stronger as a community unless we can advocate for ourselves and say, actually, we are mathematical, we can do maths, you know? We come from a mathematical background.
Thank you for the questions, and for Jodie for your responses. I'm now handing over to my colleagues Carmel, Mesiti and Esther Chen. Please come forward to express a word of thanks to Jodie.
Hi everyone, I'm Carmel Mesiti, and it is my pleasure to express our sincere gratitude from us at the ICCR. So it's Esther, myself and Jan. We've continued the ICCR, which was David's centre, but we've turned it into a research hub, and I'm so pleased to see so many of you here that have participated in our events. So thank you for Jodie for accepting our invitation to give the David Clarke Memorial Lecture. It's very important to us, and I express my gratitude also to Jim and the faculty for making it available to a wider audience, because I think, you know, some of the speakers that we've had have got really important messages, and what you've delivered tonight was very important as well. So when I think about your work and how it highlights to the importance of culture and how we can support our students in the mathematics classroom, it gives me quite a lot to think about. And I mean, I'm really interested in how we help teachers develop curriculum resources from this, and I hope we can continue the conversation around that. But making explicit that connection to these other knowledges that are already present that aren't always recognisable as a form of mathematical knowledge. So that's a very interesting aspect for me. But for now, lots of food for thought, but would you please join me in extending a warm round of applause to Professor Jodie Hunter for her outstanding presentation. Thank you, Jodie, for being here.